Today we're going to be involved in an activity that won't seem like a lesson at all. We're going to drink wine, we're going to eat food together. In just 30 minutes, I'm going to try and convince you that thirst, not hunger, is the new frontier of flavor. And that if you pay attention to wine, there's a lot that you can learn about cooking and flavor interaction, and you'll be a better cook for your efforts. Now, since I'm going to be joining you at the table and not doing any cooking, I'm going to take off my toque and join you right here. Too often we decide what we're going to eat, and then as an afterthought, we choose a wine to accompany our food. I'd like to suggest a change in your thinking. Imagine for a second that wine is not the beverage you use to wash down what you eat, but instead it's liquid flavor. It's an ingredient, just the way steak is an ingredient or fish is an ingredient. If you think of it that way, then you can imagine that wine is an integral part of a more compelling dining experience. That's where we're going today. I think of this as an interactive experience where we'll taste and eat while I talk. I've gathered a bunch of ingredients together so that I can make some important points. I have a bunch of different wines. Over here, I've got a Sauvignon Blanc, I have a Chardonnay, I have a Pinot Noir, and a Cabernet. On this tray in front of me, I've got a number of different foods, and let me just introduce them really quickly. Here I've got some sautéed salmon with tomato and basil. Next to it, I have some sugar, a little bit of salt. This is steak that's cooked medium rare, but there's no salt or pepper on that steak. It's unseasoned. I've got lemon. Here I've got some dill. Next to it, some tarragon, goat cheese, and cream cheese. So, all of these ingredients are laid out in front of me. I'd like to give you a strategy for this exercise that may be helpful. I would suggest that you watch the whole lesson without gathering the food together and just see what it is that I'm doing, and then take some time to go and gather these foods up for yourself, and then watch the lesson again. If you ever reach a point where you feel like I'm going too quickly, you can just stop the lesson, catch up, and then when you're ready to join me again, turn the lesson back on again. Let's get started. First thing we need to do is taste a wine and understand what that wine tastes like. So I'm going to suggest that you grab the Sauvignon Blanc, the first wine on your left, and give it a sniff. And even before you taste it, you can appreciate the quality in this wine by the way it smells. Wine as an ingredient is a pretty compelling ingredient. It's aromatic, it's complex, it's changeable over time. It's really delicious. As a chef, I look for new ingredients, and if I could find anything that was half as compelling as wine, I would do backflips to put it on my menu. So, let's taste this wine. Before you taste, just try and decide what you smell. For me, there's a quality about this wine that is green. It smells a little bit like green apples. And green herbs as well. Maybe sage is an herb that comes to mind. So, if you want to make the wine more aromatic, obviously you can swirl it, but the wine glass is designed to funnel the aroma right up to your nose. So sort of green fruit is what I'm smelling here. Let's taste it. I would ask you, does the wine taste different than it smells? It tastes pretty green. There's a lot of bright acidity in this wine. It tastes like underripe fruit. It tastes like a tart green apple. Ask yourself, is the wine sweet? No, it's acidic. Ask yourself, is the wine alcoholic? Not too terribly. A lot of tannin in the wine, drying your mouth out? None that I can tell. And the flavors, in addition to green apple, it tastes a little bit bitter, almost like grapefruit or lemon, maybe even lime. So this is step one. You have to taste the wine and understand what you taste in that glass. Otherwise, you go into battle without a sword at your side. If you just pick up a glass of wine and say, I like it or I don't, that really doesn't matter. What matters is that you can define this wine. You know what defines it. So, green flavors, underripe fruit, bright acidity, not too tannic, not too alcoholic. The next thing I want to do is give you a strategy for pairing wine and food. Once you've tasted the wine and you've familiarized your palate with the flavor of the wine, then I'm going to suggest we go to food, and then you see what the food has to say, and then you go back to the wine and see how your perception of the wine may have changed because of the food that you ate. So, once again, I taste the wine. I taste all of those green flavors, and I'm going to suggest that you taste just a little bit of goat cheese. You don't need very much. Before you move on, ask yourself how the goat cheese tastes. It's acidic in its own right. There's a little bit of grassiness or herbaceous quality to it. It washes off your palate very, very quickly. It's not creamy. And there's a little bit of minerality, kind of a chalkiness to goat cheese. So, taste the wine and see how it changes. Now, for me, there's a tremendous resonance to what this combination is. The acidity in this wine speaks to the tartness of that goat cheese. There's a minerality in this wine that plays off the minerality and the chalkiness of that goat cheese. And then the herbaceous quality of this cheese, the grassiness, sort of tasting meadow flowers, speaks to the green herbaceous flavor in this wine. Let's see if we can take it one step further and try and focus this match. I'm going to ask you to take a little bit of dill and add it to the goat cheese so that now you're tasting goat cheese and green grassy herbs. You'll know when you get the combination right because it will taste good to you. So now I can taste the cheese and I can taste the dill. Let's go back to the wine. If you're like me, what you'll notice is a much more compelling match. There's something about that dill that speaks to those green flavors in the wine. The food itself tastes more complex, and when you pair it with the wine, the complexity just gets bumped up a notch or two. It's really kind of a fun thing to taste. Now, just so that you can believe what I just said, I'm going to ask you to taste something that doesn't go very well with this wine, and that is a little bit of cream cheese, which is right next door. So taste the cream cheese. And while these two cheeses look very similar to one another, they couldn't be more different. The goat cheese is tart. The cream cheese is sweet and buttery. The goat cheese washes off your palate very, very quickly. The cream cheese coats your palate with this buttery richness and creaminess. There's none of the herbaceous quality in cream cheese that you get in goat cheese. In fact, it just tastes sweet and buttery. Taste this wine after having tasted the cream cheese. Right away, you get a tremendous pushback. The wine suddenly shocks you. The flavor is completely changed. And the way I would explain it is this, that these foods were chosen to be expressions of the basic taste. So this cheese, in addition to being creamy, is sweet. Okay? And imagine, this food aside, you wake up, you brush your teeth with sweet toothpaste, and then you walk downstairs and you pick up a glass of orange juice. That orange juice seems so strong, less fruity, less sweet, more acidic, more astringent. That's exactly what happened here. The sweetness of this cheese made this wine seem more aggressive. This is a Chardonnay. Chardonnay is a very different wine. It tends to be a lot softer and rounder, riper, not nearly as acidic, but let's smell it and taste it. So I'm smelling sweet, round flavors now. I'm smelling ripe apples, not green apples. I'm smelling maybe even a little bit of pineapple in there. And I'm even smelling some creaminess that comes from malolactic fermentation. And maybe even a little vanilla flavor that typically comes from oak. Let's taste this wine together. Not nearly as acidic as the first wine, a little bit sweet on the palate. The perception of ripe fruit is there. It's a bigger wine, more alcohol. There is a little bit of tannin in this wine because it's seen some oak. So here's what I'd like you to do. We're going to take our spoon. We're going to familiarize ourselves with the flavor of the wine. And this time we're going to start with cream cheese. Taste that cheese, and then go back to the wine and see what you think. Here there seems to be a little bit of a resonance, the way we had with goat cheese and Sauvignon Blanc. The sweetness of this sort of speaks to the sweetness in this wine, the ripe fruit, the soft acidity, the little bit of creaminess and butteriness. And what I'd like to do is see if we can focus this combination by taking a little bit of cream cheese and adding a leaf of tarragon. And tarragon is sweet. It has an anisey flavor. It's very, very soft. A little bit of vanillin in tarragon. Chew it all up so that you can taste everything. And then go back to this wine. There's something really compelling about the creaminess and the butteriness of that cheese side by side with the flavor of tarragon that really makes this wine shine. This idea of being able to focus a wine and food match is an interesting one. It's almost as though you taste a piece of meat and it tastes good, but you think, I could add a little more salt and make a more compelling match. Or I have lemonade that's a little bit too sweet. You add more acidity and it becomes more interesting and more well-balanced. I've got some Pinot Noir over here. Let's pick up that wine and taste it. Pinot Noir is a really aromatic wine. It's known for its aroma. It always reminds me of wild cherry cough drops or dusty rose, a little bit floral, violets sometimes. There's a little cola in this particular Pinot Noir, but there's no denying it. This is an aromatic wine. So let's taste it. A different wine altogether, bigger than the first two that we tasted. There is some tannin, but there's some very ripe, soft fruit. If you ask yourself about the level of acidity, the acidity is higher than you might expect for a red wine. It has some bright acidity. And when you're looking for acidity in a wine, what you should look for is kind of a mouth-watering quality. My understanding of it is this, that your body has a certain pH, and if you take something in, like wine, that is at a different pH from your body will respond by trying to put things right again, back into balance. So acidic wine, I get this big flood of saliva. It waters down that acidity, and I recognize an acidic wine or a tart wine as a mouth-watering wine. All right, come on over here, and we're going to taste some salmon. I've got some salmon that's cooked. It is a mild fish, very, very rich with oil. Unseasoned, so right now I'm going to put a little bit of salt on my palate. And the weight of that salmon is almost identical. The weight and intensity of flavor is almost identical to what I get in this wine. The richness of that fish is sort of cut by the acidity in this wine, and there's something about the aroma of Pinot Noir that speaks really nicely to this fish. We're going to try and focus this combination by not only having salmon with a little bit of salt, but salmon with salt and some tomato, which is nothing more than ripe fruit, and some sweet spices like basil. So let me gather this one mouthful together. It's also a delicious dish, but once you've heard what the salmon has to say on your palate, and with the memory of what it says lingering on your palate, let's go to the wine. The sweet spice that I get from basil, it always reminds me of baking spices, it brings out some sweetness in this wine. The tomato is a ripe fruit in its own right, so it echoes the ripe fruit in this glass. We already found the weight and intensity of the fish to be pretty nice with what's in this wine. I think it's a good combination. I think it works. There's one thing that I would say, and that is this, that acidity is important in wine. Likewise, it's important with food. And I have a wine here that has acidity at this level, right up here. I have a fish with tomatoes that has acidity down at this level. And so I can add lemon juice to that fish and bring the acidity up to and equal what I find in the wine, and the wine will stay in balance. So acidity in the wine, acidity in the food, I add lemon juice, and I bring the fish up to close to where the wine is. Let's see what that looks like. So a couple of drops of lemon juice on the fish, a little bit of salt. I'm going to build myself another quick bite. The really interesting thing is the fish tastes better now. But let's see if it tastes better with the wine. I think it's a pretty compelling match. I think it's pretty delicious. Just be careful that the acidity in your food does not go beyond the level of acidity that you find in the wine. Otherwise, the wine starts to fall apart. We've got one more food here. I've got some steak, and we've reserved a nice Cabernet Sauvignon for that steak. Let's take a little look at this wine. You can see it's very, very opaque and dark. It's heavily extracted. I would expect this to be a big wine. And when I put it to my nose, it smells only partially of fruit. It actually smells like the plant that the fruit grows on, the briary quality, the leaves of blackberries. Let's taste it. A little bit of tobacco there, black fruit, dark fruit. There's a vegetal quality to this that I think is pretty forward. Most people don't look to Cabernet to be vegetal, but the Sauvignon designation means savage. And in Sauvignon Blanc, that savage quality translates into vigor in the vine. It's a wild grape variety. So we choose in a Sauvignon Blanc to celebrate that wild grape variety, which is incredibly vigorous, puts out a lot of greenery, and ends up tasting green because of it. But in a Cabernet Sauvignon, we want to downplay that vigor. We don't want so much green flavor. It's not uncommon here in the Napa Valley to see vineyard workers stripping leaves from vines to make the Cabernet less vegetal. But still in all, there is that green flavor there in the background. Too much of it, and you might call this a veg bomb. Not very much acidity. It's a very full-flavored wine, full, round. There's quite a bit of tannin in there, and yet it's smooth and delicious. There's a lot of flavor. And many people reserve steak for Cabernet Sauvignon. So we've tasted the wine. I'm going to grab a little piece of steak here and chew it up. Now I'll remind you, we did not season this with salt or pepper. I just cooked it medium rare. I want you to see how you like that steak with the wine. So, you know what the steak had to say. Let's taste the wine. If the wine seems stronger to you, if it seems less fruity, more astringent, more tannic, less sweet, then I would say things are probably right with this world. The problem is that that steak is not seasoned. As it is, it's an expression of pure savory flavor, what we called earlier umami. And umami can make wine taste strong, and not a good way. So the fatal flaw is not seasoning this properly. I'm going to take some salt and add it to this. And now that it has salt on it, let's taste the steak again. Likely the steak tasted better for having been seasoned. To me, it does. You'll know when you get the amount of salt right because the steak will taste delicious. But let's see if the wine tastes better for having been seasoned. Everything that was right about that wine earlier has just come racing back. It now is fruity, it's soft, it's round, it's balanced, it's very, very appealing. I was about to say sexy, but I won't go there. Seasoning is an important consideration. So we've had a bunch of different foods here that we've played around with. There's only one that I haven't touched yet, and that is the sugar. And I told you what happens when you add sweet food to dry wines, just the same way when you take sweet toothpaste and you add it to dry orange juice. Sugar can make wine taste stronger and aggressive, less fruity, more acidic, more tannic, more astringent. So I'm not even going to do it on camera, but I would encourage you to do it when you have the time. What I'd like to do now is try and distill everything we learned here into a strategy for wine and food pairing. So here we go. This is 6 steps for wine and food pairing. The first step, and we did it already, is to taste the wine and make sure you know what defines this glass of wine. And it's not important whether you like it or you don't like it. What's important is that you can answer a half a dozen meaningful questions. Is it sweet or is it dry? Is it tannic or is it smooth? Is it acidic or is it sweet? Is it alcoholic and hot or is it a low alcohol wine that's very soft? And then maybe you can start to think about the intrinsic flavors. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? That's step 1. Know what defines what's in the glass. Step 2 is to ask yourself the weight and intensity of the wine. So a Sauvignon Blanc maybe is lighter than a Cabernet Sauvignon. The Cabernet is more heavily extracted. The Sauvignon Blanc seems to have brighter, crisper, lighter flavors. Chardonnay may be somewhere in between the two. The weight and intensity of the wine can also refer to how heavily extracted the flavors are or how ripe the flavors are. This could taste like green apples, or it could taste like ripe apples, or it could even taste like apple butter, apples that have been cooked down to a jam. We need to establish the intensity of the wine if we can move forward. So step 1, define what's in the glass. Step 2, pay attention to the weight and intensity. Step 3 is to decide what we're going to cook. And we're going to take everything that we've already learned in the previous steps, and we're going to embrace that information and say, if I have a medium weight wine, then I want a food that is of medium weight. So a medium weight Chardonnay, I might choose a chicken breast as an example. If I have a steak that has much more flavor, I might reach for a bigger wine like Cabernet. The beauty of a Pinot Noir is that it's sort of a middle-of-the-road wine in terms of its weight. So it can go towards salmon, but it could also go towards steak. So step 1, define the wine. Step 2, weight and intensity. Step 3, decide what's going to define your food. What am I going to cook? Now, you need to really understand what defines the dish. And for the most part, we define our dishes by proteins, but it doesn't have to be that way. It could be beans, it could be a rice dish, it could be a vegetable dish. Step 4, we need to decide how we're going to cook this food. And every distinct cooking technique will bring something different to the food. As an example, if I steam the food, I impact the flavor the least. If I braise the food, it will be deep and rich and round and complex. If I saute the food, I will have oil as a part of that dish, and the oil lends weight and flavor. If I roast the food, there'll be sweet, gentle browning, gentle Maillard reaction that will give me sort of a soft, round flavor to the food. If I ask myself which food would be most aromatic if I cooked it in a particular way, I would say smoking. And smoked food, interestingly enough, tastes great with an aromatic wine like Pinot Noir. So aromatic technique, aromatic wine equals a good wine and food match. Step 4, choose a cooking technique. Step 5, we need to sort of build relationships. Just the way I took goat cheese and tasted it with the wine, good but not great. Add dill, good moving towards great. You can focus wine and food matches. You can build relationships. And that, I think, is an important lesson. You start with basic and then you drill down to finer and finer detail. So this steak, for instance, all on its own, was harsh with the wine. And then I added salt, and that made it better. Because there's a little bit of green flavor in here, I might choose to use resinous herbs like rosemary or thyme or even bay and see what that brings to the match. And then finally, the last step, step 6, is to season the food appropriately so that when the food is properly seasoned, the wine tastes great. And you experience that with the steak, maybe also with the lemon juice that we added to the salmon. A little bit of lemon juice, a little bit of salt can make a huge difference. So as you get to the end, you should have a fork in one hand, you should have a wine glass in the other, you taste the food, you taste the wine, you evaluate the combination, and then you ask yourself, does it taste stronger, more aggressive, less fruity, less sweet? And if it does and you want to tone that down a little bit, you know that salt can tone it down. You've learned that acid can sort of tone it down a little bit. And a few drops of lemon juice or a sprinkle of salt may be all you need to bring this match into focus. We've already learned a little bit about wine and food pairing. I'd like to approach it from a different perspective that might help you understand the concepts. What I have laid out here on this tray is the 7 deadly sins of wine and food pairing. This is a list that was put together by someone in France, and they decided that all of these foodstuffs were hard on wine and for that reason should be avoided. And what I'd like to do is walk through them really quickly, tell you what the issue is, and then see if I can't find a solution. So we'll begin with chilies. Chilies are an irritant. Tannin is an irritant. Alcohol is an irritant. Acidity and astringency are all irritants. If you rough up your palate with too much spicy food, wine can hurt. But if you find that you've got spicy food, choose a wine that has low alcohol, no astringency, no tannin, and maybe has a little bit of sweetness, and you should be right with the world. As an example, Latin or Southeast Asian food with a Riesling or a Gewürztraminer, and one that's off dry is even a little bit better. Here's vinegar. Vinegar is spoiled wine. Why would you put spoiled wine with wine? Well, we put vinegar into a stew because it was a little bit rich and needed a little kick of acidity. Vinegar did not define that dish. Vinegar was simply a seasoning. And when you use it that way, it shouldn't be a problem for wine. If you Put so much vinegar in a dish that it becomes all about vinegar, then watch out. Eggs have a coating quality that can coat your palate, especially when they're cooked a little bit undercooked, like a 3 or 4 minute egg. And with the coated palate, the wine will just slip right by and you won't even notice it. What you may notice is that there's a sulfurous compound in eggs that can play up the sulfur that's inherent in the winemaking process, and it just turns ugly. But consider this. If I take those eggs and I put them into a quiche, what defines a quiche is the wonderful roasted flavor of the crust, the buttery flavor of the crust, the cheese, the bacon, the onions. Yes, it has eggs, but eggs don't define the dish. You should be fine. Over here, spinach. Spinach has a compound called oxalic acid that can make wines seem somehow sort of metallic. And so when you eat spinach, make sure that you redefine it in some meaningful way. A few leaves of spinach added into a stir fry, as an example, would not be a problem. Spinach that's sauteed with garlic and herbs probably would not be a problem. Artichokes. Artichokes can make wine taste sweet, and the reason for it is an enzyme called cynarin. So what do? Well, you don't eat artichokes just like this. What you do is you steam them, you take off the petals, and you dip them into a mayonnaise. And I'm here to tell you it's less important what you dip into the mayonnaise and more important what the mayonnaise tastes like. At the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter that I'm dipping in artichoke. It could be kitchen sponge, and I would enjoy it just as much. If the heart is taken and the heart is cut and added as a garnish, for instance, in a veal or a lamb stew, that dish is all about the lamb stew. Depth, rich, flavor. It's not about the few pieces of artichoke that you've added to the dish. Asparagus can make wine taste awkward, rob it of fruit. So how can you redefine this? Well, you could take this asparagus and you could cook it so that it's defined by the cooking technique. I'm thinking I might take this and grill it, and now I taste the char and a little bit of smokiness. And if I put some Parmesan cheese on top and some thyme, I might not even recognize it as asparagus any longer. And then finally, soup. Soup is a beverage in its own right. And in France, what they would tell you, at least in classical cuisine, is that you would not pair a wine with soup because it would be beverage with beverage. But I think what they're talking about is clear soup, like a consommé. If you have a rich, hearty soup, like a minestrone with cheese and olive oil on top, and you eat it with another piece of cheese or some crusty bread, there's plenty of wines that you can find in Italy that will do really nice things with a soup like that. So learn what you can from the 7 deadly sins, but don't be shackled by them. Move on, solve the issue, and get on with enjoying wine and food.